that conversation now with our panel. R.S Sharma, former CMD ONGC, is joining us on the show. I'm speaking with Upasna Bhardwaj, senior economist at Kotak Mahindra Bank, Madhavi Arora, lead economist Emkay Global, and Mayank Shah, senior category head Parle Products, is also with us on the show. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for speaking with us. Upasna, let me begin with your take. I asked that question earlier as well. How much of impact, how much of relief are you in that section of people, of economists who believes 20 to 40 basis points is the extent of relief we probably see? I think you're on mute, ma'am.
Yeah, so my inflation projections have been revised down by 24 basis after the recent announcements that have happened. But I'd just like to highlight a couple of points here. One, on the fuel costs, of course, the fuel prices have come down. There is also announcement on, or rather cushioning the fertilizer price and hence the probable impact that the farmers would have had on the input prices. That too has been cushioned to an extent. On the LPG side, we have a subsidy. So all of that is clearly providing a downside pressure to prices in the near term for sure. But for the fuel price specifically, the nuances are such that we know that the OMCs do have under-recoveries. Estimates are anywhere between 10 rupees to probably 15 rupees. That's what appears to be the case, which means at some point in time, we would be seeing higher prices, higher pump prices. It may be delayed, but I don't expect that to really continue unless we really see crude oil prices crashing down. So somewhere, while right now, yes, there is downside pressure, we'll have to be watchful on the crude oil trajectory.
Let me come to Madhavi on that same point. What is your assessment of the impact on inflation as a whole? Are your inflation projections changing? And do you also think there's scope for more relief on excise duties?
So I agree with Upasna that, you need to watch out for the behavior of OMCs. As per my estimate, the net direct and plus indirect impact of, the current policy move should be to the tune of 40 bips plus. And of course, the second round impact, which could come on the back of, other key input intermediaries that the government has sort of given relief on. But again, one needs to watch out for the behavior of OMCs because as she rightly mentioned, they are sitting with a very, very high under recoveries of around 12 rupees for diesel and I think 14 rupees, 15 rupees for petrol. And they may want to recover their margins later, especially if the global prices stabilize. At the same time, they're also, sitting with off-budget under recoveries of around 200 plus per cylinder. On the LPG base. So that also needs to be, seen in that context because the OMCs are heavily losing on that front and they may need to take price hike immediately unless, of course, the international LPG prices drop. There are some chances due to, seasonality, it may happen. But on net, at this point, oil remains elevated and thus we need to see, whether, these companies actually tend to pass on the full price impact in the medium term. In the immediate run, of course, the policy direction looks to be pretty firm that, there is sort of a combined effort both from the fiscal and monetary sense to contain inflation and probably bring it down to a more reasonable range, say around 6.5. At this point in time, inflation looks to be pretty ominous. I think the next print for the month of May could actually be close to around 6.8%. And the next 2 quarters still look to be 6% plus. So clearly RBI is sitting with a huge task of, containing inflation as its policy target. So I think the pressure is now off to the government. And again, OMCs are bearing a brunt of that to some extent.
So, both of you all have raised the point of whether the OMCs will pass on further hikes or not. Mr. R.S. Sharma, do you think they will? Because we've discussed this in the past. The OMCs are supposed to do this transparently because that's our policy, but there's a pause on rate hikes depending on whether we're in election season or not. Considering that inflation is really beginning to hurt, has become a huge political issue as well. Can we safely assume that OMCs will sit tight at least for now?
Tamanna, you have used the word transparently, so immediately a smile came on my face. Where is the transparency? Do you think there's a transparency?
I also said supposed to.
I was just reading a
I
statement.
also said supposed to, sir.
No, I'm just a statement from Reliance BP. that they are suffering under recoveries of 13 rupees on diesel and 13 rupees on petrol and perhaps 24 rupees on diesel. I'm not able to digest these numbers. First of all, could be some exaggeration there, but surely these all marketing companies are suffering huge under recoveries, and these decisions are done at the behest of the owner. You know who's the owner. So the way owner directs, the way owner says, or you may call it the backseat driving or directions in the national interest, whatever you may call it. But unfortunately, there's no transparency. And personally, let me be honest to say, this is a very abnormal situation. There's need not be, keep the things the closed. Let it be known to the stakeholders and let it be known that it is a very abnormal situation. There's no way that the entire burden can be passed on to the consumer. But look at it. All these marketing companies, they have made huge profits. So it's not because the refinery margins are very high. International prices, the price difference between the crude and the products is quite high. Still, they are making good profits. Only thing is, let it be known. It cannot remain camouflage. At least I have been in the industry so long, I find difficult to take it that it is being done transparently.
So let me come to the question that I started the show with. Is there scope for more? Is there scope for more than this 8 and 6 rupee cut on excise? Can states do more? That was an interesting sort of analysis by the former CEA on top of the show, if some of you all heard it, who is arguing that all of the cuts that have been announced by states on VAT is just a process of the cascading impact of the tax. They've not really cut anything. This was naturally going to happen because VAT is charged on excise plus base price plus. So do you think that there is more scope for states, number one, this question for Mr. Sharma, and number two, do you think there is more place or space for a further excise duty cut?
Yes, definitely. I feel there is a scope to do more. Reason being, I'm sure that they are economists. They will vouch for it. The last couple of months, the government is having unprecedented, GST collections. So that compensates substantially that what loss these companies, the sovereign government would be incurring by reducing the excise duties. And plus, mark my word, when these excise duty were increased last year, or rather in the year 20, when this lockdowns happened, that time and the crude oil prices had crashed down to the 20s or less than 20 also. That time these excise duties are increased, additional excise duty were levied, and it was said if the crude prices again go up beyond the level of 50, 60, so all these additional excise duty would get reduced. It is getting reduced at the time, of course, in the month of November last some reductions were done.
Yes.
And now they are getting reduced when the prices have crossed $110 for the crude oil. So this should have been done earlier, but I definitely feel there's a scope for more. How the fiscal deficit will be managed, how the government will take more borrowings. And these are unprecedented times, so I feel let it be answered by the two very eminent economists here,
yes,
that what should be the right step in that direction.
And how much more scope there is. I will come to the eminent economists, but first let me come to Mayank. Thank you for your patience, Mayank. I was keen to hear from you today from, to get a sense from the business point of view, because I know that high fuel costs have been a pain for business as well. All input costs have been going up and driven up by high fuel costs. Do you see an immediate relief here, and can you hope for, or do you hope for more?
As far as immediate relief is concerned, yes, definitely, because fuel, cost of fuel does not play a role just in terms of SCM, supply chain or logistics. but it even plays a significant role in terms of input cost of other raw materials. So, for example, if you have a decentralized manufacturing facility and you have multiple manufacturing facilities, for example, something like biscuits or bread, or for that matter, bakery items are made out of wheat flour and edible oil and sugar. Now, sugar and wheat flour are typically sourced in South and in East from North and West. Now, if that is the case, this commodities move from here to there, and typically at any given point in time, the prices of this commodities would be at least 1 or 2 rupees higher than that of North or West per kg. The reason being freight. Now, when the freight goes down, even the input cost, and it's not just the cost of moving the finished product, but even the input cost goes down. And there's a reason why we see, some cushion there, not only on the movement of finished product or logistics cost, but even in terms of, cost of other inputs, which typically are sourced from, different zones or where there is an inter-zone movement. So that way, I think, it provides a good cushion. In terms of expectations, I think central government or center has done a great job by probably reducing rupees 8 and rupees 6 in excise, and they did that earlier in November also by about 5 rupees and 10 rupees in petrol and diesel respectively. And as you rightly said, I mean, VAT is ad valorem, so it's the price plus excise on which the VAT is added. So I think whatever VAT reduction has happened because of the reduction in excise, and there is more that is expected from now state governments, at least those states where the government is not of the ruling party, as in the central government, the party at the center. So states like those now need to probably come forward and reduce
why just opposition
VAT.
States should cut VAT? Why shouldn't all states cut VAT?
The ruling party states, central ruling party states have already done that. And I think, of course, there is scope there as well. But
right.
I think, there is more scope in states or where it's hurting more is the states which are not ruled by, the center.
I will ask Upasna to come in on that. Do you think there is scope from the point of view of states? Do you see a distinction among states on who can cut more or who can cut less? And can the center go further?
For the states, I believe that some of the states do still have room to an extent. The ones who really did not go ahead in the November series of cuts. So there we may possibly see. But when we talk about the room for cuts, we will look at it from a fiscal headroom perspective.
Yeah.
And at this point, we have to look at states' finances. They do look difficult, especially given that on the GST side, the compensation is ending by June 2022. And beyond that, they will be on their own. There is no really no compensation from the GST shortfall that could happen. And otherwise, also, there would be shortfalls happening, although there are certain components we may see upside, but the expenditure categories which are being budgeted as of now by the states, we have about for 18 states, the collections, they seem to be budgeting a fairly high expenditure growth. So if they were to meet that expenditure growth, there is very limited room to really go ahead with aggressive rate VAT cuts, let me put it like that. Even for the center, at this point in time, there are direct taxes which have a reasonable upside because these were the buffers which were built in the beginning of the year. Clearly, we also have buffer coming from a higher nominal GDP growth, which will be providing more buoyancy on the tax collection side. But there are much more shortfalls that are happening. One is happening because RBI dividend is lower than what was earlier budgeted. We also have here the fiscal subsidies, rather, the fertilizer and the food subsidy, which is likely to be huge. LPG subsidy, which has been provided for. All of this, if we take together, the fiscal deficit is already looking alarmingly high. It will be probably as high as last year, as against the 6.4%, which was budgeted for the center. So we're looking at 6.8% fiscal deficit, which is an increase in absolute terms of 1.75 lakh crore. That's a huge amount. It really puts a lot of stress on the bond markets because they are already heavily weighed down by supply concerns. So financing, like you initially correctly pointed out, is a very big challenge. We do not have FPIs buying at this juncture. We have, in fact, outflows happening. Banks are already sitting with excess SLR, huge amounts. So we don't really have too many sources of purchasers for SLR demand, SLR bonds. And to that extent, I think it will become a challenge financing, especially because RBI too cannot step in materially in this rate hiking or policy
that point,
tightness.
of course, Madhavi, I want your view on the center versus state controversy and whatever you want to add on that. But just the point about how further the Reserve Bank will now go with its interest rate hikes, which are expected. The former CEA also commented on this earlier in the show during his interview, hoping that they aren't very steep hikes. Do you think there will be some kind of tempering in the pace of interest rate hikes post this cut?
Yes, so I think the counter-cyclical fiscal responses to both consumption and inflation essentially has been an ask from some MPC members. So this move definitely is coming as a relief to the Reserve Bank, especially because such move can actually tame household inflation expectation much better than RBI rate hike per se, especially because most households have a very high recency bias and a bias towards food and fuel inflation. So I think to that extent, it sort of tames household expectation much better and thus may ease off some pressure from the Reserve Bank in the medium term. But that said, as I mentioned, in the immediate run, inflation still runs pretty high to the extent that it probably would print close to 6.8% or even more in the immediate next print. And thus, I think to that extent, there should be front loading in the Reserve Bank's reaction function, at least in the next 3 to 6 months or so. Post that, I think once they reach the pre-COVID policy rate level or close to around 550, say, on the repo rate, I think the bar for further tightening incrementally may become very high, given that the fact that the sacrifice ratio or the growth inflation trade-off probably would become much more higher. So I think one needs to watch out for some measured policy move from the Reserve Bank. I'm not on the camp of a very aggressive rate hike. I think RBI would tread very cautiously once they approach close to around 5.5 on repo rate. Largely because even pre-pandemic, the kind of growth that we had and at a particular rate, which was 5.15 on the repo rate, I don't think that we were actually growing at a very smooth pace. In fact, the growth at that point also was tepid, and RBI was looking to be accommodative or wanting to be accommodative at that point in time as well. So I think at this point in time as well, even though we are seeing green shoots of growth coming, I don't think that actually there is much lever to the growth side. In fact, we are seeing much more headwinds from global front, which could actually weigh down on growth further. And to that extent, I think the policymakers might tread very cautiously before following the path of the Western world as far as rate hikes are concerned.
Yeah, something that Dr. Subramaniam also echoed earlier in the conversation. I'll have to wrap it here, but I want to thank all of you for joining us in this fairly detailed and extensive conversation, trying to understand what exactly are the implications of this excise duty cuts that have been put into place and what impact they really will have.